Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's program. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Later, you will have the opportunity to ask questions during the question and answer session. You may register to ask a question at any time by pressing the star and 1 on your touch-tone phone. You may withdraw yourself from the queue by pressing the pound key. Please note this call may be recorded. I will be standing by if you should need any assistance. It is now my pleasure to turn the conference over to Mr. Larry Spiwak. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody, and welcome to another Phoenix Center Teleforum. Today's Teleforum is entitled The FCC's Open Internet Order, a Law and Economic Analysis. And what we hope to do today with our all-star panel is to take a good critical look at what the FCC's order does and doesn't do. So first, a couple bit of housekeeping items. The first thing is that we have conference slides. I'm sorry, this is decidedly low-tech, but if everybody goes to our webpage, which is www.phoenix-center.org, at the very top of that webpage in the What's New box, you will see a little line that says Phoenix Center Teleforum presentation slides. And so if everybody goes there, if you're available to it, it's a PDF form, and we have slides, and that you can follow along George's presentation. So as you're busy doing that, let me go through quickly today's agenda. We are going to start with an economic perspective by our chief economist, Dr. George Ford. After that, we will have a legal discussion about what's in the order and what's not, with an all-star cast, and I appreciate all of my friends for showing up on that. We have and I'll repeat this later on, we've got Sam Fader, who's a partner at Jeter & Block and a former general counsel of the FCC, Angela Giancarlo, who's a partner at Mayer Brown, and she's Rod McDowell's former chief of staff, Tom Navin, who's a partner at Wiley, Rein, and the former bureau chief of the FCC Common Carrier Bureau. For those of us who are doing this a long time, we don't call it the Wireline Competition Bureau, and I think it's particularly apropos that we're now calling it back the Common Carrier Bureau, at least among us old telecom professionals. And Jeff Lanning, Vice President of Federal Regulatory Affairs for CenturyLink. And again, if we have time at the end, we will do some Q&A. So to get things started, second administrative item, if you want to tweet, our usual hashtag for our events is PHXPolicy. That's PHXPolicy. So hopefully as everybody can get the slides, and George will cue you up on which slides to move on to, but I'm going to turn this over to George right now for the Economist perspective. So George, take it away, please.
Great. Thanks, Larry. Appreciate the time here. I will try to get through this quickly to hear the legal experts. I think this is primarily a legal matter, and I'm not an attorney, although I pretend to be one on occasion. Not a very good one, unfortunately. I'm going to go through the slides here. Basically, what I want to do quickly is review the paper that we did entitled Tariffing Internet Termination back before the order came out, where we laid out, this is slide 4 if you want to go to slide 4, where we laid out what I consider to be the first and only attempt to outline how Title II regulation would be done if we took as truth the way the FCC had described the problem of network neutrality or the open internet. And in that paper, we used the FCC's 2010 order, its 2014 NPRM, as well as a Verizon opinion, to define what market was going to be regulated. This is slide 5, by the way. And the market that was going to be regulated, you can go to slide 6 and see, was a transaction between the broadband service providers and the edge providers. It was not between the broadband service provider and the end-user consumer. All of the incentives, perverse incentives alleged by the FCC had to deal with the broadband service provider and the edge provider. And in fact, the FCC in its 2014 NPRM, which was the NPRM that formed the basis for the current order, just released order, they described the market as a two-sided market where you had consumers on one side of the BSP, and the second side of the market, slide 6, it was the market between broadband providers and edge providers. So this was the relationship, and continues to be, as I'll discuss later, the relationship of interest in this market. So this is the transaction we wish to regulate, and if you're going to regulate something, you have to define what transaction is that you want to regulate. Moving on to slide 7, which brings us to the second point, is the FCC labeled the broadband service providers as terminating monopolists. They continue to do so in the most recent order as well. So you have a transaction between edge providers and broadband service providers, and the broadband service provider in that role is a monopolist. So then you move on. So what kind of regulation are we going to do here? And it's quite obvious that the regulation is price regulation. You have a monopoly, and we're going to regulate the monopoly, regulate the transaction price between the edge provider and the broadband service provider, and we regulate that price at a price of 0 was the proposal, or possibly not 0 in some cases, because in the 2010 order, at least paid prioritization was a possibility. But it was specifically price regulation, even though we hear consistently that it's not price regulation. The type of regulation is exactly that. The other point about the terminating monopoly was forbearance would be forbearance from tariffing a termination charge between the BSP and the edge would be very difficult, because you would be forbearing from tariffing in what is plainly price regulation and price regulation of what the FCC has described as a monopoly. So the basic story was you would end up having to, if you did move to Title II, you would end up having to tariff a termination service at a positive price, because a price of 0 would be confiscatory in this type of relationship. On slide 9, we see that this was exactly what Wheeler was proposing originally with his hybrid proposal, was to separate the retail and the wholesale segment into these two parts. So we had the 2010 order, we had the 2014 NPRM, and then Tom Wheeler's proposal, Chairman Wheeler's proposal, all accepted this view of what this transaction, the regulated transaction, looked like. That changed later, of course. Moving to slide 10, what I want to go through briefly here is how our argument made in that paper was treated in the order, and whether or not the recent order, 2015 order, really changes much or somehow sets aside the arguments that we made in that paper. The Internet order explicitly addressed the argument that we made in one sentence, not in any of the sections relevant to our paper, but it did talk about it, and it said we reject the argument. I mean, that's pretty much it. That's often the case when the FCC doesn't know what to do with an argument. They just say we reject it and move on, and that's its prerogative. But let's look more closely at what the FCC said in its order and how it compares, rather than just assume that it rejected it. Let's look at what it said. On slide 12, and I'm just going to provide a few quotes for you here from the order. And here's slide 12 is the definition of the bias, which I think is the most appropriate name I've ever heard come out of an FCC order of this nature, which is the Broadband Internet Access Service, where they argue that in defining the service, we respond to the Verizon Court's conclusion that they furnish a service to edge providers. We make clear that Broadband Internet Access Service, or bias, encompasses this service to edge providers. So the FCC here, in its definition, has recognized that there is a service to edge providers and is attempting to say, I'm going to combine or latch this service to some other service. Okay, that's going to be problematic, I think, legally. It's certainly nonsense economically, but legally, I think that's a vulnerability. Slide 13, broadband providers function as gatekeepers for both their end-user consumers and edge providers. Again, the Commission has said these are two separate services. Slide 14, the record provides substantial evidence that broadband providers have significant bargaining power in negotiations with edge providers. Okay, again, we have a service. Broadband providers are negotiating with edge providers. That is a separate transaction than with the end user. And then slide 15, broadband provider is the sole provider of access to an end user. Again, it is a monopoly providing a service to edge providers. The D.C. Circuit noted that the Commission convincingly detailed broadband providers' market position, which gives them the economic power to restrict edge provider traffic and charge for the service they furnish edge providers. Okay, so again, we have this. This is a service, and the FCC is trying to bundle it with some other service, but it is quite clearly, as expressed in the order, a service. And you also notice on slide 16, it is charge for the services. They have the power to charge for the services they furnish edge providers. And then slide 17, there's a toll, the potential for tolls for edge providers to reach the broadband. So here we have not only a relationship, but a relationship that permits a charge or a fee to be levied in this market, which is distinct from the market from the end users. And finally, on slide 18, again, same kind of language. The BSP can charge edge providers for access. And on slide 19, we see the same argument being made for mobile providers. Mobile providers have an interest in seeking rents from edge providers. So we have the possibility here of a transaction between the edge and the BSP, completely independent from the end user arrangement. I also found interesting in slide 20 that the Commission may waive the ban on pay prioritization. Now, what this is basically saying is, while we prohibit it generally, we may waive it, which is basically saying we may permit in certain circumstances the BSP to engage in a transaction with the edge provider. That's an independent transaction. It is a positive price, independent transaction. So despite the fact that the FCC is trying to evade the argument that we made in Tariffing the Internet, it's doing a horrible job of doing it, because it's repeatedly stating that there is a transaction, a unique transaction that exists between the edge and the broadband service provider that could involve positive prices. And it actually can involve positive prices by its own standard. On page slide 21, we see a big quote from the Verizon FCC's order, which basically affirms that even if the broadband providers aren't charging today, they could, and that this relationship they have is a service and could be a service, and at some point the broadband service provider could choose to offer that service. On slide 22, we sort of get to the meat of the problem when we realize what network neutrality really is, and that is today's no blocking rule prohibits broadband providers from charging edge providers a fee. Okay, so when the FCC gets down to the nitty-gritty of defining what is its core principle, which is no blocking and the no throttling and all that, just as sort of a add-on or a backstop, so there's not sabotage, since they're actually setting the market up for sabotage with their regulation. Here we have what the open internet really is, and I think no blocking is sort of the core of it, is that it is price regulation. It's price regulation at a zero price. We recognize there could be a positive price. The FCC recognizes that there could be a positive price and may have permitted at some point. The FCC says this is a unique transaction between the two, and we'll try to smother that by combining it in this new definition of broadband service, but in fact it's not. It's just an attempt to work around an argument that's going to be very, very difficult to work around. So I think slide 22 sums it up. This is zero price regulation in the termination market, the second side of the market between broadband service providers and edge providers. Okay, slide 23, both the Verizon opinion and the concurrence dissent recognized that this no blocking was in fact zero price regulation. Some of the language is kind of weird in the decision, but it's clear they recognize that's what it is, and I think a court will be open to that argument going forward. I have the quote here from the dissent, which I thought was quite useful, mainly in the sense that both the dissent and the opinion both agree that this is zero price regulation. Going on to 25, and I'm almost done here. It's really clear in the order and all the precedents to it, including the NPRMs, the 2010 order, the court decisions, that termination and origination, the end user side, are different, are distinct services. The customers are different, the prices can be different, the incentives are different, and the FCC is merely conveniently lumping them together, which is convenient for what they're trying to do, but it's really pretty silly, both because of the precedent and because of the way that the discussion in the order proceeds. The FCC again confirms that they're monopolists, and in fact, I think that there's a fairly decent argument that the Commission would make, or somebody could make, that they're not only monopolist in the terminating side, but they're also monopolist on the originating side. And 45% of households have only a single provider of what the FCC defines to be broadband today. So when you think about forbearance, you sort of run into that wall again. And now the FCC wants to make the argument that competition is not the sole basis for forbearance, which I think is a little too clever, because when we talk about the role of competition in forbearance, we're talking about tariffing, we're talking about price regulation. Now, if you got an accounting rule, then maybe you don't need competition to abandon an accounting rule of something that's being counted that's no longer even useful. That's true, and we see that in some cases. But in any case, if we de-tariffed a service, a requirement of that was that there's competition. And the reason we do that is because the forbearance section requires that rates be just and reasonable. There be some force that leads to that. And if you look on slide 27, you go to the Orloff case, which FCC doesn't even deal with in its order. It basically says it stands for the principle that when you de-tariff, then you surrender pricing to the market. And what the FCC is essentially doing here is it says we're going to de-tariff the service, but we're not going to surrender it to the market. We're going to de-tariff a service that we mandate to have a price of zero. And that's a strange enough I think to draw a problem. So I think the slide 28 to finish up, that the logic of the paper that we wrote, Tariffing the Internet, even though the FCC says we reject it, I think that the argument is actually buttressed by the most recent order, the 2015 order. This is plainly, unquestionably, zero price regulation. It is zero price regulation implemented without tariffs, and it is zero price regulation in a market that's clearly defined and clearly distinct from the other, even though the FCC tries quite poorly, in my opinion, to wrap it all up into one thing. So I think, and we'll certainly hear from people more expert in this maybe than myself, that the zero price regulation thing is really the order's greatest vulnerability. But I'm sure there are many more, and we will find out about those now. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, George. Appreciate it. Okay, so let us now turn to our all-star legal panel. Again, we've got Sam Fader from Jenner & Block, Angela Giancarlo from Mayer Brown, Tom Navin from Wiley, Rein, and Jeff Lanning from CenturyLink. All have many, many years of experience and are truly excellent lawyers, each one. So, as this is really like a very bad onion, and there's so many layers to it, what I'm going to try to do in our legal discussion is go through a series of themes and various topics that we can try to spend a little bit of time on each one to start picking apart the various elements of the order. So the first question I have for the panel, and again, anybody feel free to jump in, a lot of people have talked about that one of the lead arguments is just a question of notice, APA notice, that the FCC really essentially changed so dramatically what they did from their May 2014 notice of proposed rulemaking to what they did now, that that they should have put out this set of rules for not the way they did it, but put it out as a new further notice of proposed rulemaking. And I was just wondering to the panel, do you think that's a valid rationale for appeal? Is that a legitimate theory for appeal? So who'd like to take that question?
Larry, it's Sam. I'm happy to start.
Thanks, Sam.
Let me start with the caveat that, this order has a lot of political baggage, and courts are, although much less political than the FCC, are political as well. Mm-hmm. And notice is a convenient hook to throw something out if you otherwise don't like the smell of it. But I guess my view is on the merits that the commission did an adequate job on the notice here. I think some of this stuff could go either way, but if it were a fair, impartial court, I think the commission likely wins. I've seen much worse notice cases where the commission wins. I've litigated them.
Right.
But I think for example, on the coverage of interconnection, yes, they didn't really propose covering interconnection in the rules, but one, they did ask a question that it could be a logical outgrowth of, and two, as the order points out, there's a good argument that this is not a rulemaking point. It's just the implications of the legal classification of once you make bias a common carrier service, that under 201 and 202, practices in connection with telecom services have to be just and reasonable. So I think they do okay there. Reclassification itself is interpretive, and they ask a lot of questions about that. I think the harder questions come around the coverage of the mobile, whether they adequately noticed how they might change its view of what CMRS means. Even there, though, I think that they had enough in the notice that they asked whether CMRS would be covered or how it would fit. And I think under the traditional test for notice, which is whether the rule adopted is a logical outgrowth, that could go in the commission's favor. So again, I think the arguments are worth making because you don't know what's going to stick, but I think it's a tough sell.
Yeah, this is Jeff. I'll add from a practical perspective. I think what Sam says is all exactly right legally. You always make these arguments. They add color for other arguments. But another important point to remember about these kind of APA process arguments is, generally speaking, the result is a remand for further analysis, not a fundamental reversal on the actual substantive rationale. And the FCC can cure them, of course, then always by just sort of having a further rulemaking and reaching the same outcome. So they're interesting points for appeal. They probably will be talked about a bunch, but I don't think that's where the heart of the discussion really will be.
Okay. Well, let's move now to some more meaty issues. And let's start first with the actual question of reclassification and the rationale both for wireline and wireless. The FCC basically said, well, we've got Chevron deference and we can account for changed circumstances. And I know all of us on this panel have talked about this a lot. Do we think that the Commission has made a persuasive argument to get past Brand X? Tom, let's start with you. What do you think?
Well, I think the starting point is to acknowledge that this decision represents one of the most breathtaking reversals of law in the past 25 years of telecommunications regulation. If that is your starting point, I would say that the Commission had a reasonably high hurdle to get over to explain the necessity, assuming Chevron deference, which I don't necessarily concede that point, but assuming that they were to get Chevron deference, I think that they would have to come forward with a fairly compelling rationale for how and why the internet market that the Commission has written about for almost 25 years now has changed so fundamentally and precipitated the FCC's extraordinary reversal of many fundamental classification determinations. I personally don't think that they made that case, and in particular, I don't think that they spend much time talking about the competitive substitutability, in particular on the wireless side. You have to, in spite of the fact that they spend a little bit of time talking about the early termination fees make the customers less likely to switch providers, I don't think they did a particularly compelling job at showing that if a a wireless broadband internet access provider were to engage in certain behavior, that the customer wouldn't simply leave that provider. So I think that's a fairly big hole that the commission has. I know that in part they seek to fill their competitive analysis hole by redefining broadband on the wireline side at a level that narrows the scope of provision of services to two providers, and in some instances a single provider. But I am always stunned in telecommunications how little analysis is done of the substitutability of services on a per transaction basis, regardless of whether or not the services are substitutable in total. The Commission back in 2006 and 2007 recognized, for example, that mobile long distance was becoming a complete substitute for wireline long distance. And it's that type of substitutability analysis, which we all know is going on in the market today for all services, both voice and broadband, that I think that the Commission's order is weak on.
Yeah, but didn't they just say, well, now under the change of circumstances, basically the providers are now selling rather than selling an integrated service, they're just now selling directly a broadband transport service, broadband internet service. I mean, that seemed to be what they were sort of hooking this whole thing on, and they're saying, well, you're even marketing it on, on your fast and speeds, and then they added on top of that, the functionality. They said, no, we're just gonna, so it's like a switch, it's all part of it. I mean, what's the standard? The telecommunications systems management exception. Sam, I mean, what do you think about that?
So, Sam, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I thought they did a decent job. Again, I thought they did what they had to do.
Right.
And this is the same commission that sold the D.C. Circuit on the virtuous cycle argument that regulating the internet would get you more investment. So, I think in the deference I expect them to get, they're in pretty good shape. Now, I think most of the things they say about how the internet has changed was true at the time they made their last determination on this stuff. But again, I don't think a court's going to dig into stuff like that. I mean, I think they've articulated a compelling vision of how it fits the statutory definition.
Jeff, did you have something?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I think Tom focused a lot on the change, and that's, I think, where a lot of the questions really do go. Sam points out that agencies get a lot of deference when they change their mind. It's the one thing I would point out to everybody is at the time that the Kennard Commission decided not to make a telecom, and then the Powell Commission decided to make an information service, it was widely regarded throughout the communications bar that's a pretty close call. There were a lot of debates around protocol conversion and DNS lookup as whether that's an information service. Point being, and I think even if you look at Brand X, the point being, the Commission probably originally could have gone either way on this. They went the information service route for what we think were great policy reasons, and were upheld. As Tom points out, the debate now is probably going to be more about whether they could change their mind, not about whether this could be declared a telecom service in the first case.
And I think, and on Jeff's point, I would say it's the bar they have to clear for purposes of changing their mind. And I don't think they made a particularly compelling case. I think I disagree with Sam on that.
I have to disagree. I'm with Tom on this one. I thought, in particular, on the wireless side, there was really, even though they're taking pains to explain what's changed and what's new since 2010, it really isn't new. It's exactly, the arguments that they used in 2010 for not extending the rules to wireless. And I think that their conclusions are just a leap. So hopefully, in a reviewing appellate situation, the court really digs in to see for itself that the assertions here, the arguments here, even though the orders describing them as meaningfully changed, they really aren't.
Well, let me follow up with that real quick, Angela, because you're our wireless expert here. I mean, the agency, if you go through, the argument's always been wireless is different, not just because given the technological aspects of it in terms of, limited spectrum and so forth, but also just in terms of the way Congress, set up the law with private radio. And yet it seemed to me that the commission went out of its way, even changing the definition of PSTN to just public switch network, to sort of gerrymander wireless broadband into a CMRS service. And how do you think the court may look at that?
I think I was stunned by how sweeping and broad that change was. That it's very significant, and I don't think that the rationale matches such a significant change. And I have to hope that the appellate lawyers, whoever they are, would do a good job of explaining to the court, why such a sweeping change does not match with the rationale in the order.
Okay. Well, as we're tight on time, let me now move to the next topic, which is the FCC's theory of forbearance. Just as a quick administrative note, just as the FCC sort of ignored our analysis in our paper Tariffing the Internet with just a single sentence, they also did the same thing for our law review that we had published in Commonwealth Conspectus a month or two ago on the FCC's forbearance authority. So I think that they've gone a little farther on this, but I'm going to let the panelists talk about it. So here's my question for everybody. Does the FCC's theory of forbearance in the order make sense and comply with the law? It seems to me that, and I think George touched on this a little bit in his speech, the FCC focuses on the promotion of competition, not whether the rates will continue to be just and reasonable. And I think that's a really important point. And then they also have sort of the secondary backstop, which says, well, they focus on the language that talks about is necessary. And their argument is, well, we can forbear from all this stuff. Even the presence of monopoly, which we concede is still there, but trust us, there's other regulatory items. And does that give this bizarre, theory of forbearance and credibility, and then just the precedential impact of this going forward when somebody else tries to raise that? So let's start with Tom. What do you think about that?
Well, let's just say it's passing strange that they do this forbearance analysis without the type of rigor that the General Counsel's office typically required of any order that the Wireline Competition Bureau put out during my tenure as bureau chief. So
that's man speaking with a lot of experience, folks.
I just seem to recall General Counsel Fader requiring more of us than what the FCC has put in this order.
General Counsel, Sam, you want to get a comment?
Unanimous votes.
I think the forbearance is on the weaker side for this order. I agree with Tom. I think it's sort of smart on their part. If you're going to have a weak part in your order, put it here, because the challenges they're going to get on that side are going to be certainly less strong. Look, that said, I think if you get a court that's willing to go along with everything else, I think they've said enough here to tie it into the statutory language and explain why it's different. And if you look at the 1994 CMRS forbearance order, they similarly conceded there wasn't competition. The reasons were a little different, but it was pretty similar as to the why of granting forbearance. So, I think this one could go either way, but I think if you get a court that's going to go along with everything else, they'd probably just accept it.
I hope you're right, Sam. This obviously, the forbearance is something that, from a policy perspective, CenturyLink thinks is it makes sense. There should be more of it. We've had a very hard time getting forbearance. Tom is right. It's very ironic that when we ask for forbearance, it's basically no way, and they set impossible bars like they did in the Phoenix order. But when they want to do the forbearance, they just kind of find it pretty easy. I think the other really interesting point, and perhaps more concerning policy point, is one that the Republican commissioners raised in their dissent, and I think is really true when it comes to Title II, and that is most everything they forbore from, they can actually still do under 201 and 202. 201, 202 is interesting. It is true that wireless voice today is regulated with just those two provisions, basically, and works out to be a pretty deregulatory environment. But we often forget that if you look at Title II, the only operative substantive provisions in there, really, as it stood back in the 1950s when we were dealing with the Bell system, were 201, 202, and Section 214, which is the sort of requirement to provide service and to get approval to provide service and no exit. So they forbore from that one. So as a result, I mean, most of the regulation of the Bell system was done with 201 and 202, which that's obviously pervasive, extensive monopoly regulation. So it's a very broad grant of authority that they have, and they've now applied to retail broadband internet access services, and FCC probably can do most of what it wants. So on some level, a lot of the forbearance is, we don't take as much comfort in it as we might want to.
Well, that's a really good segue. Now, let's actually move then into what I would describe as the application of Title II. I mean, the thing that struck me is a guy who started his career doing a lot of electric utility rate regulation, and I thought I was always done with this, and I guess it's come back to haunt me, is the FCC's expanded use of the JNR standard. I would probably argue that they've turned that standard from what has traditionally been a rate standard into a conduct standard. So, there are a couple elements of this I'd like to touch on. I mean, the first thing is that we'll also talk about the unreasonable discrimination standard in a moment too. So you've got, as Jeff said, 201. I am convinced at this point, and as George is going through in the economics, that by setting up the no blocking, no pay prioritization, no throttling rule, that is essentially zero price regulation. And because we are not talking about carriers, but carriers to customers, again, we've done Title II. It had the commission done under Title I in Section 706, we would have had a lot more leeway with the commercially reasonable standard. But now we're invoking an 80-year-old statute with 80 years of case law. How does the commission get around under 201 forcing people to take traffic without just compensation? That seems to me the epitome of a confiscatory rate. It's zero pricing. I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts on that.
Okay, I'll go quick, but obviously Sam and Tom and Angela have really probably more important things to say. I will say that as a practical matter, that you're right. I mean, I think you're right in your analysis in the context that no blocking and no throttling is really tantamount to regulation, and that's kind of what the court said. I do want to distinguish. We have always had no blocking in telecom, even where we have rates. It doesn't have to be a rate regulation. It can be a straightforward common carrier regulation. I think the D.C. Circuit, started there. But in this context, where they're also very clearly denying the ability through any other means to get compensated, it's really a way of further enforcing the zero rate. So I think your focus on the zero rate is important. I would focus more on that than the no blocking, because in theory, no blocking doesn't have to be problematic. I mean, that is a sort of inherent.
Yeah, the traffic always goes through, but at some point you got to talk about price. Anybody else have any comments on that?
I'll just say, Larry, I agree. It's definitely zero pricing, and it's definitely a huge departure from the way just and reasonable has been understood for the past 80 years. The question for me is whether they're allowed to change their interpretation, right? And whether they said enough to explain why this is different. And so, I just, like all of these things, I don't know how high a hurdle it really is in a court for them.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
It might, that's an interesting question. It may become more problematic as they engage in price regulation, because at the end of the day, I mean, what they're saying is you got to recover the costs from your end user subscriber, which could put upward pressure on the rates, the prices that the broadband provider charges to its end user consumer. So if in combination with end user consumer price regulation, you have the what you call zero. What do you call it? Zero price.
Zero price regulation. Mm-hmm.
Zero price regulation or zero price termination. That strikes me as plainly confiscatory or definitely problematic. But as long as they can recover fees from the end user consumer, I'm not sure it's problematic.
All right. Well, let's move on from there, because let's turn to the sort of the other side of the coin, which is the unreasonable discrimination. One of the things that really struck me about the order is that, for all the years I've been practicing communications law, 201 deals with J&R rates, and 202 is the statute that deals with unreasonable discrimination. Yet the FCC in the order very deliberately said, "Oh no, we're on terms of paid prioritization, we're banning it not under the unreasonable discrimination standard of 202, but we're doing it under 201B, which I guess at the very end of that statutory section just talks about the commission as a broad public interest authority."
Yeah.
Does that hold up? Anybody?
You stumped them.
I stumped them. All right. Well, in that case, I mean, because you seem to be, and I think George talked about Orloff as well. If you were a common carrier, you've always allowed to engage in reasonable discrimination and to set different prices as long as those prices are set for similarly situated customers for like services. Again, how do we reconcile the FCC's new interpretation of reasonable discrimination versus the 80 years of case law on this?
Yeah, and Larry, again, I guess I say, you're right, but they can change it at any time. They have to explain it, and so it's a question of whether their explanation was adequate.
Yeah, but here's my question about that. The FCC is not the only agency that deals with the just and reasonable and undue discrimination standard. FERC has that both with electric utilities, who are not common carriers. FERC deals with that with natural gas pipelines, who are not common carriers, and also deals with oil pipelines, who are common carriers. I mean, surely a court's going to look at all of that rate-making literature and go, look, I know you have a different interpretation, but we've been kind of doing this across the board for all regulated industries for rate making for 80 years.
Yeah, I guess I don't think so. I mean, I feel like it may be the same language, but look, the FCC itself has interpreted the identical language in CALEA and the Communications Act to mean different things. So it's not like if it were if it were the Constitution and everyone had to interpret it, but this is the FCC statute, and they can interpret it differently than FERC, and courts have allowed that kind of thing.
Yeah, I guess so.
Fortunately, that language in B that you refer to has the magic public interest in it, which we know can mean everything and can mean nothing.
Right.
It means whatever the majority says it means, and unless it's completely irrational, a court would tend to think, oh, okay.
Okay. All right. Let's switch gears to our next topic. One of the things that really struck me about this, and this is almost a procedural question I have for everybody, and everybody who's worked at the commission here. One of the things that struck me about the order is that the commission delegates pretty much all of the major policy calls, both in terms of advisory opinions and adjudication of disputes, to the Enforcement Bureau. So now we all know from FCC practice that, eventually after something becomes very routine, then you kick it down the Enforcement Bureau because you don't have to do it. But here you're making some very major calls, interpreting your and yet the commission is creating, if you will, a fiefdom down in the Enforcement Bureau. Is this a good idea on how we should? Well, it's a good thing we're doing case-by-case adjudication. The commission's not ruling on this case-by adjudication. So I was wondering what everybody's thoughts were on that.
Larry, this part of it bothers me a lot. But I can't say that we haven't been prepared for this because since the current Enforcement Bureau chief arrived, he's been doing a lot of sort of meet and greets and brown bags, etc., and has been really very clearly saying that his folks are going to get involved in policy. And, you know, he talks about how they're, you know, closely coordinating with the substantive bureaus, but they also have expertise in policy. Now, that's never necessarily been my, you know, take on the Enforcement Bureau. The way it usually works is some of the policy folks might notice something and refer it over. But the point you make makes it even more clear. This is, no matter what, no matter who has the substantive expertise, there isn't very much yet. So all the more reason why I don't know that it's appropriate to go to Enforcement Bureau. The other thing I did was I researched when the Enforcement Bureau was created. I went back to look to see what I thought I would find would be an order describing the new bureau and how it would work and what its responsibilities are. But all I found was a news release. Apparently, Kennard made the announcement during testimony before the House. He was testifying on then the FCC's 5-year strategic plan, and he basically just announced that there was going to be a new bureau and here's who's going to be in charge. Now, I can't find anything about any reference to an order or any commission vote on it. So that may all be irrelevant and water under the bridge at this point, but it's a little troubling that something so new is going to a group of on delegated authority.
Yeah. Sam, Tom?
Yeah, this is Sam. I agree with Angela. It bothers me that it goes to the Enforcement Bureau, recognizing that they're going to coordinate, and hopefully they will coordinate extensively. But, you know, the Enforcement Bureau's MO is to really shoot first and ask questions later.
Right.
It doesn't give people a lot of comfort about how this is sort of going to play out. And what really bothered me was this notion of the advisory opinions that the Enforcement Bureau could issue, where they can't issue an opinion on anything you've already done. They can't issue an opinion on anything that you are just thinking about doing. You have to actually be going to do it. And you know, basically, people are in the dark about what's going to get them into trouble, and then the people that are going to be making those case-by-case judgments are the people most inclined to get people in trouble. So I don't think it's a recipe for a lot of comfort.
And Larry, I'll just say, as nice a guy as Chairman Kennard is, I think it was a fundamental mistake to take enforcement out of the policy-making body at the FCC, and I say that for a very simple reason. Anyone who's been involved in crafting rules, writing rules, knows that it's impossible to write the perfect rule.
Right.
And the policy branch has to be given the opportunity to refine that rule in, with further clarifications, whether they come in the enforcement context or simply by issuing declaratory orders. But the policy-making branch has to be given that opportunity. And quite candidly, I think the Enforcement Bureau has a much, larger incentive to take a position that's really antithetical to the policy basis for the rule in the first instance. So I think that's really problematic.
Yep.
All right. Well, I have two quick last questions as we're running short of time here. First one is, and what would a call like this be without raising federalism and universal service, because we would be incomplete. One of the interesting points I found about the order was they went out of their way to say, bias is an exclusive federal interstate service. States, you have no rules, you have no authority here, we will preempt you. Don't even think of assessing universal service charges on this. And by the way, we're not going to do it either until we start to think about it in the further notice. So have we opened up a Pandora's box here with universal service in the states and defining an intrastate broadband internet access service. I mean, I thought the FCC was extremely coy about saying, no, we're not imposing USF charges yet. And I was wondering if the panel had any thoughts on that.
Yes, the Pandora's box is open. I think coy is the perfect word. A lot of at this time, do not presently, sometime later in the language. And, I think those of us that are familiar with universal service and have been involved in some of the universal service battles over the years know that this is really just a question of time. And I think that they left the door open for the states, too, because they're describing, the FCC is describing its own role as temporary, and I read it as the implication being that, oh, and by the way, our preemption of you here is temporary, too.
All right. Anybody else on that? Okay. So here's the last question I would have. We now have this 330-page order, and it does a lot of things. And I guess my question is for everybody who's experienced telecom lawyers, could the overall objectives of what this order sought to do be done without invoking the Title II nuclear option? Could the FCC, if it really had tried, based on what it had done in its May 2014, continue the light touch regulation, or was the FCC really put up against the gun and having no choice but to do Title II?
I think they had to choose about whether they wanted to ban paid prioritization outright or not. And once the decision was made to ban paid prioritization, I don't think they had a choice.
I agree with Sam. I think that once they, and that of course was that was the hue and cry, was always about paid prioritization. So that was kind of strategic advocacy, in my view. But as we all know, it didn't stop there. The invoking Title II for that simple reason just wasn't enough.
Well, I tell you what, to the conference moderator, why don't we take one or two questions if we have time for that, then we can wrap this up. So, conference moderator, if you're there.
No problem. At this time, if you would like to ask a question, you can press star and 1 on your touch-tone phone. Again, that is star and 1 on your touch-tone phone, and we'll pause here a moment to allow questions to queue. And we'll take our first question from Lydia Bioid, with the Bloomberg. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Hi, Lydia.
Hi, Larry. Thank you all for participating on this. It's been great. I'm curious if any of you saw the two petitions filed late yesterday by U.S. Telecom and Alamo Broadband in different circuits, and they seem to be interpreting some of the rules on when the federal rules on when this order is final, and sort of have filed just in case. I don't know if any of you can comment on the timing of that.
I'm happy to try it, Sam. I think they were just taking a belt and suspenders approach, because a declaratory ruling is appealable basically as soon as it's released, whereas a rulemaking, it's not appealable until it's published in the Federal Register, and because the order was a combination of the two, they wanted to make sure that the FCC didn't argue that they were precluded from challenging the declaratory ruling part later because they'd missed that window.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else?
At this time, we don't have any other questions in the queue.
Okay, well, in that case, I would like to thank all of my panelists who are doing this. Sam, Angela, Tom, Jeff, again, really appreciate everybody participating. I hope the audience enjoyed our conversation. As always, check out our website, www.phoenix-center.org. We've always got a lot of papers. And please stay tuned, because the Phoenix Center will be doing our annual Rooftop Policy Roundtable sometime in May and June. We're working on an official date, and that's always a great event. So, again, thank you, everybody, for showing up. We appreciate it. And with that, we will see you at the next event. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Larry.
Thank you, Larry. Thanks, guys.